mode.
So we're going to get started now. Welcome to our Spring Sustainability Seminar Series. I'm Kishore Rajagopalan. I'm an Associate Director at the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center. For those of you who are new or joining us over the web, the mission of the center is to advance sustainable practices, reduce pollution, and enhance human and environmental health, with a particular focus on the industrial and manufacturing space. We are one of 5 surveys organized within the Prairie Research Institute. The Institute, through its integrated, objective research, seeks to ensure sustainable economic development, enduring environmental quality, and cultural resource preservation for the people, businesses, and governments of Illinois. The theme of this Spring Sustainability Seminar Series is to listen to various perspectives on issues related to sustainability in Illinois, such as environmental protection, energy, and so forth. We've also encouraged our speakers to articulate their priorities, perceived needs, opportunities, and ongoing work in the hopes of stimulating broader conversation. I'm pleased to welcome Warren Lavey today. He is an adjunct professor in the UIUC Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences, as well as the School of Earth, Society, and Environment. He is also a senior fellow at the Environmental Law and Policy Center and senior regulatory counsel at the American Clean Skies Foundation. He has degrees in law, economics, and applied mathematics from Harvard and Cambridge universities. I'm really envious of you for doing all those things. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping points. The restrooms are in the hallway across the reception and through the door to my right. In case of an emergency, please stand up and follow the instructions of John Scott, our safety officer. With that, Warren, that's all. Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks very much. Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you for coming. My topic is on cleaner trucking services, and I'm talking about 2 types of mechanisms that governments and large organizations can use outside of what you might think of as the primary drivers of cleaner trucking services in today's society. One driver is obviously the renewable fuel standards, and there's a lot of discussion here about biofuels and such. You know, that came about through legislation and EPA regulations. And also standards for miles per gallon, or fuel efficiency, that have come about through regulations adopted by the EPA together with the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. So I'd like to thank Kishore on 2 accounts. One is for inviting me to speak today, and secondly for arranging for the background briefing that was held 3 days ago. It was very nice of you. Well, if you don't know what I'm talking about, let's see, the president did a major speech on trucking services on Tuesday of this week, and he pointed to the need for further EPA regulations to move forward beyond the regulations that were adopted in August 2011, that set a progressively higher standard for fuel efficiency and controls on greenhouse gas emissions through 2018. So, those regulations are the first of a kind for heavy-duty trucks and are designed to ratchet up the fuel efficiency and control of greenhouse gases over a period starting in 2014. So these were adopted in August of 2011, but 4 months earlier, the President pointed to the availability of cleaner trucking services vehicles, infrastructure for fueling and such, and challenged fleet operators as well as shippers or logistics providers to have a cleaner energy fleet. It's good for your bottom line, that is lower life cycle costs with these alternative fuels. Also good for the economy, good for the country, and good for the planet. So obviously we're not working in a framework where we should be sitting back and waiting for the manufacturers of trucks to produce better vehicles in 2014 through 2018. That's great. The country should have those vehicles available. But the point is that even 4 months before the EPA adopted those regulations, cleaner vehicles were available, and the President was urging the major fleet operators to go out then and buy cleaner vehicles. So, we're talking about areas that kind of go beyond what the EPA has been requiring, and I'll give you a quick overview of the technologies in terms of lower emissions and energy efficiency before talking about these two specific tools. So, just to point out, this was a 2012 comparison done by the U.S. Postal Service, showing a wide variety of different types of vehicles with different types of fueling systems that were available as substitutes for the vehicles that it currently had. So, some of them have much lower annual fuel costs, and they might have similar or somewhat higher initial acquisition costs for the vehicle. But the point is there are a variety of different technologies out there. And with those different technologies come different footprints in terms of fuel efficiency as well as emissions. So different types of fuels, have different carbon intensities to them. The top line is for ultra low sulfur diesel, which is a tremendous advance over the type of diesel fuels that were available 10, 15 years ago. But on the other hand, it's still very carbon intensive. And then you'll see that biofuels, electric vehicles, natural gas fuel vehicles, have various carbon intensities, with the lowest being compressed natural gas coming off of landfills. But again, the point is that the marketplace offers a variety of different types of fuels that have different carbon footprints associated with them. And in fact, carriers and logistics providers have already differentiated themselves in terms of how they run their fleets and the vehicles in those fleets. So here is an analysis done in 2012 for carriers that are in the same market segment. They provide package delivery services. And the emissions by the top 20% of carriers versus the bottom 20%. And you'll see that in carbon dioxide emissions, the top 20% has roughly 30% lower emissions than the bottom carriers, and the range is even greater when looking at nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. Now, why should we be concerned about the emissions from heavy-duty trucks? Well, transportation accounts for a big portion of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, a little bit behind the electric power sector, but still a huge area that's part of trying to get our country to a more sustainable level of carbon emissions, as the President pointed out earlier this week. In fact, trucks account for a very large portion of the total transportation emissions of carbon dioxide. So they emit about 1.5 times more greenhouse gases than cars, even though cars are much more widely used, more cars on the road, and certainly a lot, 75 times more than buses. And the emissions from trucks have been going in the wrong direction, right? So here's an analysis from 1990 through 2008 that shows growth of greenhouse gas emissions from trucks, 74%, at the same time when cars grew about 19%. And just one further indicator of the importance of this segment. The U.S. and China, announced an agreement in July of last year, on 5 action initiatives in their climate change working group, and very prominent among them was addressing heavy-duty vehicles. And aside from kind of global climate change, trucks are targeted in terms of their disproportionate impacts on minority and low-income communities in the context of environmental justice. And we'll see that played out in the examples that I'm going to go into. And then to bring it home to Illinois, well, the Chicago Climate Action Plan adopted in 2008 estimated that 21% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions are from cars, buses, trucks, and trains. And it's great that Chicago's putting in more bike paths and easier pedestrian access and such. But the real bang in terms of reducing the transportation sector is going to come in terms of freight movement. And to give you some sense of the low-hanging fruit here, Cook County has participated in the EPA's Clean Diesel campaign, where money has been available to purchase and install diesel filters that would catch the particulate matter emitted by trucks at a cost of about $35,000 of expenditure for particulate filters. And the typical filter is between $5,000 and $10,000 per vehicle. But if you spend $35,000 on these kinds of filters, you'd get benefits on the order of 60, 70 times as great, benefits of over $2 billion. So Illinois and Cook County and such have been focusing in on potential gains here. All right, so now let me get to the 2 tools that I'd like to focus most of my talk on. This is beyond legislation and federal regulatory actions. One tool is in the area of conditions on access, and the second tool in terms of environmental preferences in procurements. All right, conditions on access. Well, the leading example is the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. They had a tremendous amount of truck traffic, both within the port and going to and from the port. The trucks, that are accessing the port would have lots of emissions in the neighboring minority, low-income areas, causing public health problems. And the ports got together and said, okay, fine. We're going to impose certain conditions on the use of vehicles within the ports and access to the ports, right? The agreement came about in 2008, and it provided for a phase-in of emission standards over the next 4 years. And with those standards came a requirement that all truck operators had to file maintenance plans and annual reports. And then there were some additional steps, like truck impact fees that had incentives for cleaner trucks. They also provided for a grant program to assist the truck operators in purchasing cleaner trucks. So how did it turn out? Well, about an 80 or 90% reduction in truck emissions, through this program. So by imposing a ban on trucks that were then almost 20 years old, toward the end of their useful lives, they eliminated, 1,500 trucks that had the worst fuel economy, the worst emissions of particulate matter and other toxics. That $56 million in incentives that the ports have made available was leveraged with private investment of about $1 billion toward the purchase or lease of a total of 7,000 trucks that were cleaner and would operate with lower emissions within the port area and then throughout their hauls. And this led to health benefits for about 2 million people living near the ports. And before this program was instituted, these trucks were estimated to cause hundreds of millions of dollars of public health costs annually. So what can we do in terms of trying to replicate this program in other facilities, or to use conditions for access through municipal actions as a way of pushing truck operators toward cleaner vehicles? Well, the Supreme Court said that this program, was lawful, that the municipality could impose conditions on trucks accessing the municipal facilities, right? Could bar a truck from operating its facilities, at its facilities, to prevent an ongoing violation of the agreement's requirements. The Supreme Court struck down a couple other aspects of the program, but they were relatively minor. So basically a green light for municipalities to look to conditions for access as a way of addressing truck pollution. Now, let's turn to Chicago. It had a good set of conditions in terms of moving forward in this program in a number of different ways. Now, I already mentioned the Chicago Climate Action Plan from 2008 and the prominence of truck emissions and hopes for reducing the emissions from freight movements. In 2012, Chicago bought 20 electric refuse trucks, recognizing alternative fuels, lower emissions. Chicago has a tough anti-idling standard that should reduce emissions from all kinds of vehicles. And also, Chicago participates in the Illinois Green Fleets program, which provides incentives for adopting cleaner vehicles and filters. Moreover, Chicago's been pretty innovative in some other aspects. For example, they created a program that provides an incentive for natural gas-powered taxi cabs that run with less emission of particulate matter as well as carbon dioxide. It didn't cost the city anything. They just established a priority access to the short trip lane at O'Hare Airport. And this was very valuable for the taxi operators. It initially came in as a 6-month trial program. They renewed it twice. Ultimately they decided to drop it, but it just shows that there are a variety of different tools that municipalities can invoke in order to help address emissions, and some of which don't have budgetary impacts. Finally, just as a background condition, Chicago had just gone through work with community organizations on an agreement that started off with a municipal ordinance that had wide support among council members, but ultimately became negotiated in the mayor's office, that would force lower emissions from 2 coal power plants that were operating within the city of Chicago, at Fisk and Crawford. And sure, there were arguments that imposing controls on these plants would cost a few hundred jobs, but the city government recognized that public health and quality of life in these neighborhoods was clearly impaired by the operation of these old coal power plants, and ultimately they closed. So now let's turn to a neighborhood in Chicago called Englewood. Probably not a place that you've spent much time in, but it became a focal point for this whole development of conditions for access and addressing truck pollution in Chicago. So it's on the southwest side of Chicago. And if you've heard about Englewood, it's probably because it's on the news almost nightly in terms of shootings, stabbings, other crimes. It's a low-income minority community, 50% unemployment, very poor air quality already, with high asthma incidents, many abandoned sites, and high crime. In Englewood, there was already operating a freight terminal run by the railroad Norfolk Southern. There were about 1,250 trucks daily going through the streets of Englewood to and from the rail yard. And the street access was included areas that would go directly in front of primary schools and other heavily populated areas. But Norfolk Southern proposed to expand this yard. It would spend $285 million increase the size by about 85 acres. It said it would create 400 new jobs, and that there would be increased truck traffic both within the yard and to and from the yard by 500, 800 trucks. So total about 2,000 trucks now going through the streets of Englewood, because of this rail yard. So initially, the City Council, this is April of 2013, approved the proposal for Norfolk Southern. It would purchase these abandoned lots, and then sell them to Norfolk Southern. And the City Council got some concessions from Norfolk Southern that it could say served environmental goals, like taking unused rail spurs and making them into a bike trail, more open space and such, and also some money toward transportation improvements and schools in the area. But it wasn't until after the City Council approval that the community groups and the environmental nonprofits, including ELPC, got active. The proposal from Norfolk and Southern would involve expanding 2 tax increment financing, or TIF, districts. And that required approval of the Chicago Plan Commission, which is usually expected in the ordinary course quickly, if the mayor and the city council are already on board. But in this case, the Chicago Plan Commission heard from neighborhood organizations as well as environmental nonprofits, and it delayed the vote. In fact, it delayed the vote for another 5 months. And in that process, there were some additional concessions, from Norfolk Southern. So the final agreement, was that Norfolk and Southern would impose pollution controls on 36 of the 38 trucks operating within the yard over a 5-year period. It would also adopt cleaner engines or filters for 12 pieces of lift equipment in the yard. And that year, it would provide another $1 million fund for environmental projects in the neighborhood, including contributions to improve a park, another $1 million for job training, and the city said to the neighborhood that it would make efforts to address truck congestion and idling. No promises in terms of specific actions on routing, signaling, and such, but the city said to the neighborhood organizations, maybe there's more that we can do for you. We'll try. All right, so this was a major step forward for the city of Chicago in terms of looking at the approvals for trucks in terms of accessing a facility that required city approval, and using that to get some progress toward cleaner trucking services. But was it enough? Okay, so again, compare Los Angeles and Long Beach, where over a period of a couple of years they addressed 7,000 cleaner trucks, right? $1 billion of investment. Here, Norfolk and Southern said that over a 5-year period we'll phase in controls on 36 trucks. Well, those trucks are probably going to be retired anyway over pretty short time. But again, it's important precedent. But it raises some questions. So I wasn't at the negotiating table personally, but I just want to throw out some ideas. It's an academic setting, right? And kind of leave you with the idea that maybe there's some progress that can be made for other facilities, that are under the control of, whether it's the city of Chicago, state government, other cities, military installations, or whatever. So, just some ideas. Did the city consider that as a condition for the transfer of the city-owned properties that it would phase in standards for the vehicles using the rail yard, as Long Beach and Los Angeles did? So look, there's a difference. I mean, the yard, the ports are owned by a municipality. Here's there's a private yard. But on the other hand, there's plenty of municipal involvement here. The railroad turned to city council to buy up the lots, which became city property before they were transferred to the railroad, and also some approvals in terms of the expansion of the TIF districts and other types of infrastructure improvements. So that was an opportunity to phase in some standards. Doesn't really show up. What about strict enforcement of Chicago's anti-idling ordinance, both in the neighborhood and in the rail yard? You know, the number of newspaper investigations a couple of years ago turned up that the ordinance looks good on paper, but in fact it wasn't being enforced. You know, so here's an existing ordinance, you know, where the city could have turned to the community and said, you know, we're going to put the manpower behind this to make sure that, you know, when these trucks are coming to and from the rail yard, they're complying with the anti-idling standards in the rail yard and the surrounding community. You know, what about this Illinois Green Fleets Fund, right? You know, you could prioritize the heavy users of the rail yard in terms of taking advantage of these rebates for the purchase of cleaner alternative fuel vehicles. You know, similarly, there's funding in millions of dollars that, you know, go through the TIF district, you know, to facilitate the rail yard. Well, you know, those could be used in part as rebates or incentives for cleaner trucks. Or part of that funding could go to traffic controllers, you know, to make sure that trucks aren't stopped, you know, in front of the schools, you know, any more than they have to be. You know, wave them through, get them out of the community. And finally, you know, the city could leverage off of access to other city facilities, whether it's its airports or ports, you know, for the heavy users of the rail yard. You know, if they purchase alternative fuel vehicles, you know, then they would also have priority in terms of access to city-owned properties. You know, again, these are just some ideas, but, you know, I view the Englewood model as a nice starting point, you know, but, you know, maybe we can make it even more successful in moving toward cleaner, healthier trucks than, you know, was achieved in this agreement. So, got a lot of trucks on the roads, you know, in the state, the city of Chicago. You know, how aggressive will governmental bodies be in using this tool to help move the trucking industry forward even faster than, you know, the federal legislation and regulations provide for? All right, so that's one tool. Let's go to another tool. And that is environmental preferences in procurements. Okay, so aside from this regulatory function of governments, including conditions for access to facilities, you know, governments spend a lot of money. They buy a lot of trucking services, either directly from trucking carriers or indirectly when they buy freight that's going to be delivered to a governmental institution. It applies to the federal government, and I had a nice cartoon from the federal government prepared through the American Clean Skies Foundation, but it certainly applies to state and local governments, large corporations, universities. There's money that's being spent that could be done in the context of providing preferences for cleaner providers when they bid for the business. Okay, so we're in a state that, oops, something wrong. Okay.
Is that where you were?
Yep. Okay. Good. Okay, so we're in a state that leads the nation in adopting a law last August, the Illinois Transportation Sustainability Procurement Program Act. The law is great on paper. It directs the chief procurement officer to adopt certain regulations that will apply to all state agencies, including state universities. Well, you know, that's 6 months ago. The regulations, you know, haven't yet been proposed by the chief procurement officer and go through the administrative review process in the legislature and such. So, you know, we're ahead of the nation, you know, in terms of the laws. We're not there yet in terms of actual implementation. But let me just tell you about it, you know, with a sense of pride. You know, the state recognized the purpose, you know, that the state processes for procuring freight, small package delivery services, and other form of cargo, you know, consider not only cost and quality, but also the commitment to an execution of best environmental practices for vendors. Okay, this was a real breakthrough, and that, you know, the best value analysis would give weight to the bidder's greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, and other environmental considerations. So the law directs the chief procurement officer to come up with regulations by which all state agencies would collect information on these emissions and fuel consumption from prospective vendors, would evaluate that information in choosing a vendor, and then obtain from the vendor these kinds of measurements during the course of providing the services. So that's great on the state level here in Illinois. On the federal level, just last month, the U.S. General Services Administration, which provides for purchases that would then be used by multiple agencies, in this case over 14 different agencies, would be buying under a schedule contract for domestic package delivery services. So, last month, GSA moved forward and said that in light of executive orders, and legislation and such, that it would recognize that harm to the environment, including greenhouse gas pollution, has costs and negative impacts on the economy and federal agency operations, and that the government intends to reduce as far as practicable the environmental impacts of services provided under its contract. Okay, so the federal acquisition regulations that govern all the purchasing allows the agencies, in fact directs them, to take the goal of best value into account in a broad way, and to consider environmental impacts, not just price and quality of what's being offered. So this particular solicitation says that GSA will assess contractors based on their current capabilities to report environmental metrics, what the results of those metrics are, and for various types of environmental measures. And then the vendors have to submit annual targets for environmental improvement during the course of the contract, and they will be required to submit their measures over the course of the contract, and they'll be evaluated for not just the on-time performance, the number of damaged packages, whatever else goes with the delivery service, but also with what they're doing on their emissions of air toxics and also on fuel efficiency. So this was great progress for one major procurement. It's not to say that it's spread throughout the federal government, but we're hoping to build on that in the area of using the government purchasing power to push along their vendors toward cleaner trucking. So how does this work in practice? Well, Cleveland's purchasing program was adopted in 2010, and it kind of gives us a very simple, straightforward framework. If a vendor can be qualified as a local sustainable business, then it receives a bid discount of 2%. So this is designed to encourage local businesses to adopt sustainable practices, including in terms of transportation. So, just to give an example, if Company A bids $97, Company B bids $100, but Company A let's focus on Company B. Company B is a certified local producer, and it's a certified sustainable producer, then it gets a total of a 4% discount on its bid price. So it's viewed as submitting a bid of $96, and it gets the contract award. Okay, so the city will actually pay $100 to Company B for the services, but that's a better value under the Cleveland ordinance, than a $97 bid from a company that was headquartered in New York and is not, certified as sustainable. So this is, a strong incentive for the local companies to become certified sustainable. Helps them win contracts and gives them a little bit of extra money that they could use to help support the actions towards sustainability. So, just to, Kishore said I was an economist, I'll throw in one economic equation, but the idea is that the price, P, it starts with what the vendor is proposing to charge, C, but then it weighs in the environmental impacts of the vendor. So various environmental measures here, 1 through N, each of which has a certain social cost associated with it. And that is the kind of total social cost or best value price that would be evaluated in terms of comparing the vendors. All right, so yeah, that looked intimidating, but in fact, the federal government has been providing for estimates of the various factors associated with that equation on the transportation side for many years. So I mentioned earlier the diesel emissions reduction program, and that was that slide showing that if $35,000 spent in Chicago on diesel filters, you get over $2 million worth of benefits there. Well, you know, there's county by county modeling that's been done by EPA to try to associate public health benefits with clean diesel filters. Okay, so that you know, for the total program 2008 through 2010, you know, they awarded $470 million, and they estimated benefits of at least 10 times that much. But again, you know, it's built on county by county analysis. So that's an important resource that can be used in trying to estimate the social cost associated with different trucking emissions. And also, when the EPA comes up with regulations, it's required to do a regulatory impact analysis. And you know, those analyses have modeling with them that also can be used in developing a social cost analysis of trucking vendors. So, you know, here's an example of a regulatory impact analysis that's associated with particulate matter and nitrous oxides. You know, that, you know, gives a total benefit of over $290 billion. So, you know, just to go back to the basic measures of the performance of truck carriers that have been developed through the EPA SmartWay program, you know, here are some costs that are readily available, you know, to estimate the social impacts of different vendors. You know, the White House has estimated the social cost of carbon at $37 per metric ton. The EPA regulatory impact analysis covers nitrous oxides, you know, over $9,000 per ton. A big impact would be particulate matter, and again, this diesel emissions quantifier has come up with a $1.2 million per ton national average, but it's available on a county-by-county basis. And the National Research Council has also come up with an estimate, you know, as to the coarse particulate matter, PM10, related to the fine particulate matter. So these various measures are available, and the fleet operators, you know, roughly 2,500 of them, have already been reporting to the EPA SmartWay program and to other reporting initiatives. You know, their fuel consumption, the types of vehicles they use, you know, whether they have particulate filters on them, whether they use alternative fuels and such. And the result of that is that you can estimate the social costs of something like the package delivery service that the GSA was looking at, right? So remember, there was this huge disparity between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. Well, on an estimated cents per package, on national average, you know, what does it mean? Well, you know, if we're only concerned about the social cost of carbon, you know, the best performing carriers, you know, delivering one package, that's about 3 cents worth of impact. The worst performing carriers, it's more like 4.2 cents. But a big differentiation comes in terms of the NOx and the fine particulate matter. And in total, you get differences in the social costs of the emissions related to package deliveries for different carriers, where the best performing carriers have social costs of about 8 cents per package, whereas the worst performing carriers have over 37 cents of social costs. So it's almost a 4% differential related to what is being paid for the delivery service, if you also consider the social cost. And what we've been trying to do, the American Clean Skies Foundation has really been in the forefront of this, is working with different organizations. Federal government is a huge user of trucking services, but others as well, whether it's the state of Illinois or the university here or corporations. And try to get them to recognize that they can use their purchases as ways of decreasing their carbon footprint as well as their costs for public health, and integrating this idea of social cost with the purchasing decisions. So even if you don't get to the exact estimates that I was trying to show in the preceding slide, you could get some pretty good guidance out of this approach. You could look at which procurements should have environmental preferences. For example, if the state of Illinois is purchasing trucking services that are going to go within Cook County, that's going to have a much higher social cost from a bad performing carrier, than if the vehicle is operating in southern Illinois, less densely populated. Report annually and to come up with improvements over a 3-year period, and others aren't. So just using that kind of eco-label almost the same way as Energy Smart or LEED certified for buildings is being used can help move the marketplace toward cleaner trucking services. So just, I'll wrap up here and say that, the emissions from trucks have a big impact on health and also on greenhouse gases. And everything that can be done on legislation and regulations is great and needs to move forward. There's a lot of other things that can be done now, with the range of vehicles and fuels that are available in the marketplace, to encourage cleaner trucking services and to make our communities safer, healthier places to live. Questions? Yep, please.
Regulations on particulate matter is based on particle size, as if all particles were the same. And why isn't there more research on reactivity and characterization of those particles?
Okay, so the EPA... Oh, sure. Okay, good question. I'll start with that. All right, so the question was that different sizes of particles that go into particulate matter, would have different health effects. Or may have, has the EPA done the research and, do regulations distinguish size of particulate? And the answer is yes. Fine particulate matter has much greater, impact on cardiovascular, respiratory diseases than the coarse particulate matter. So the fine particulate matter is what, I was abbreviating PM 2.5. Okay, the coarse particulate matter PM10, and the EPA does have standards that distinguish, between them in terms of ambient air quality over a 24-hour period, as well as particularly emitters, and it addresses direct emissions of particulate matter, as well as particulate matter that's formed in the air, through sulfur dioxide emissions and such. But fine particulate matter is definitely more of a health problem.
My question is, why is someone interested in the composition of those fine particulates? Because a very small particle of calcium is going to have a much different effect than a small, a VOC particle.
Right.
So why aren't they doing more research?
Okay, so I'm not in a position to tell you, what the research looks like, but I know they have distinguished fine from coarse, and that there are very scientific advisory groups for the EPA that have recommended tougher standards, especially on the fine particulate matter. The EPA has adopted tougher standards, and in fact there's a pending review of the EPA decision in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals now. So, I mean, your sense is absolutely right.
That's wondering, the one, the city of Greenwood had 4%, I need to pay more money. And if you go back and put that throughout the entire industry, 4% has to be recovered someplace. Somebody has to pay that with that money, and somebody has to invest money. I believe that as hard as it is today to make money and to stay competitive, that 4% like that will go across the board eventually is a very significant thing.
Right.
How is that?
Okay. All right. So I'll give you two answers. First, with the Cleveland program, that's basically the city council saying that taxpayers should be willing to pay somewhat more for sustainable businesses supplying the city. Okay, so up to $50,000 more per contract, is what the ordinance allows for, and basically it's kind of the recognition that when people go to a grocery store and look at cleaning products, and some are green and some are have toxic chemicals, people are willing to pay a little bit more for something that's greener. Okay, but the real answer is that the trucks that are now available using alternative fuels have lower total life cycle costs than the trucks that are on the road now, using diesel. The price for natural gas or electricity or hybrids or propane or whatever, those alternative fuels are coming into the market because their cost per 100 miles for the vehicle to run are so much lower, right? Roughly $1.50 a gallon lower for compressed natural gas compared to diesel. So even if the vehicles are a little bit higher priced, for the initial purchase, right, on a life cycle basis, the cost of operation is lower. So when a company like Procter & Gamble goes out and says that for 20 major routes, it only wants to see bids from natural gas powered truckers, right? Part of that is so that they can report a better result on their annual sustainability plan. But a large part of it is because they've already evaluated it and recognized that the price that they should be getting, is lower, with that condition, right? So now you're thinking, well, why aren't truckers doing this anyway? Okay, why is it that purchasers have to prod the truckers to move forward? And in part, truckers are doing this, even without their purchasers saying so. But in part, purchasers can take a big role in moving their vendors forward. In some cases, if you offer a trucker a 3-year contract, and over the life cycle, even just in 3 years, you can recover the initial cost of the vehicle, with the lower fueling costs. But if you say to that trucker, well, give me a bid for a haul for next week, and then I may or may not renew your contract, his incentives on investing in the new vehicle, you could say, well, I'll wait until what I've got now runs out, right? So I mean, the marketplace is more complicated, but the great story is that consumers shouldn't be paying more for cleaner trucking services, that the technologies and the fuel price differential are such that you can get your transportation cleaner and not pay more. Joe?
CNG, I don't need purchasing newer vehicles that are going to last longer. Is that figured in?
Yeah. So the estimated maintenance costs associated with CNG are lower, than for diesel, and yeah, I'm not sure how that translates into life cycle cost, or lifespan. Yeah.
Last long, but I don't know if that's, I may have played that into like PG makers like that mentioned, or the last long, that's kind of effect.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so I know that they run quieter, and a lot of drivers like the CNG powered engines. But I think that's an interesting point. I haven't seen the studies. Yeah. Right. Right, and UPS committed that all of the new vehicles that it's buying this year are going to be powered by natural gas. It's not going to buy any diesel powered.
See that? CP has been helpful enough to do a longer study, probably.
Right.
How much they will save when they don't have a replace to do it.
Right.
Double mileage.
Right. And the nice part about focusing in on heavy-duty trucks is that a company like UPS will run the trucks 200,000 miles per vehicle per year, right? And if you're saving $1.50 a gallon, you're going to have huge savings. I mean, if you consider the average passenger car of maybe being driven 10,000 miles, or the average vehicle in the federal fleet is only driven about 7,000 miles. So you got some trucks that run around within an army base or something like that. I mean, these commercial truckers are great targets, for adopting the cleaner, new vehicles.
But CNG's infrastructure is not there for, that's what the problem right now.
Right, yeah, it's developing together, right? And UPS wouldn't have made this huge commitment, if it didn't have adequate fueling on its routes. But, you're absolutely right that there's some parts of the country where, they don't have, CNG fueling.
One more question. You're assuming large companies that have large truck fleet, as a large segment of the big guys. But trucks are really ran also by small business and message that she has a truck owner. In fact, she was, because I shut down her business by liquidation. I think at one time.
Yeah, right, yeah.
She's not there anymore. She's not for sale. And that was because they were able to make money. The people were competing very hard on that. Okay, now, one of the, I never had to deal with a question with her because for me to still not have events. But I do know that most of the people in there and in the United States, they have old trucks. Now, I wonder if there's any statistics how many people will be unemployed because they will not be able to. And by the way, my nephew, who was the main driver of the 2,300 that my sister had, now she is unemployed now. He's not working for $14 an hour.
Right.
Okay, as a result of that, the company.
Okay, so let me just try to answer. Right, yeah. So the question is, for a small business, are the newer truck technologies financially available, or is it a matter of running a 20-year-old truck that they've been using, at the lowest possible maintenance level or whatever, or going out of business, right? And what we've found is that companies like Ryder Trucks and other major leasing companies make the vehicles available even for somebody who's only operating one truck. You don't have to pay the capital costs of acquiring the vehicle. And we've looked at some examples of small fleets where they're better off replacing the old truck with a leased natural gas powered truck, paying $1.50 less per gallon for the fuel, and it can provide more competitive prices. So I guess what I'd say is, look, every situation is different. I can't say that it's everywhere, but it could be that your sister's company would have been more competitive because it has lower total life cycle or operating costs. And in some cases there are grants available to acquire the new trucks, like the Illinois Green Fleets program. But in other cases, if the capital costs look, too high, you can, lease a truck and still in many cases, have, lower total costs of operation, with the new technology. And again, it's something that, the manufacturers are improving, so the miles per gallon are getting, is getting better, and Obama wants them, even higher targets to be set beyond 2018. But if you look at the choices that are in the marketplace now, there are vehicles that, have, much lower cost of fuel because of better miles per gallon and use of alternative fuels, than the old trucks using, diesel.
So I have a question. So
Okay.
you talked about Englewood and experience there. And just to keep the discussion interesting, what were the arguments made to the council representing Norfolk Southern? And can you give us an idea of what their perspective? How did they approach the same issue, and what were their reasons for either doing it or not doing it? What is the common ground?
Okay. I mean, so, what Norfolk and Southern would have said about the benefits are, look, there are a lot of, abandoned buildings, empty lots, whatever, in Englewood. They could be a source of further crime and, weighing down the property values. We'll take 85 acres worth of that and put it into productive use. Next, we're going to create 400 jobs in an area that has 50% unemployment. And we're not committing to hire everybody, from that neighborhood, but, more jobs, more taxes. And also, we run in a competitive business, right? If you, say that some truckers can't access our freight rail yards because they use, old technologies and, haven't paid for the diesel filters, they'll go to other rail yards, and we won't be able to run our business. This is not, a monopoly in terms of access to, what can travel by train. So, those were their basic arguments, and the city kind of found that there was enough room in terms of the deal that Norfolk and Southern was looking for, that it could spend millions of dollars on parks or whatever else it is, and that they would commit to spend what might be $100,000 for the vehicles that they were running within the rail yard. But I don't know how aggressively the city pursued the issue of the trucks that are not owned by the rail yard but accessed. And that's really where the leverage was for Los Angeles and Long Beach, and the benefits for the surrounding community. So, I say great for Englewood. You established, first step. Maybe there'll be other opportunities to take further steps.
So, just to reiterate that, LA and Long Beach could do it because they're in essentially they're a monopoly, at least in the short term.
Right.
That they can actually, there are other issues, airport issues in LA that
Right, and the Port of Tacoma, up in the state of Washington, has adopted a similar plan.
So would O'Hare be equal to LA and Long Beach because it is a bigger hub? And would if you targeted, say, because O'Hare is committed to being one of the things. And so if you were to target the warehousing around that area, Denson Road was not that kind of stuff, would you have better success in achieving these goals?
I think that the opportunity is there for the city of Chicago to use the permits, as a way, for accessing the airport as a way of pushing toward cleaner trucks that would affect the surrounding communities. Okay, there's a lot of emissions already from the aircraft, but a lot of and from the cars, but the trucks, shuttle bus, and such. So airports have taken an initiative. Like the Denver airport only allows electric and natural gas powered shuttle buses. There are other airports that, especially if there are corridors, underneath some of the runways, they don't want these, diesel trucks, with high pollution, there. They require cleaner trucks, right? So there are other examples of airports taking this initiative, and I think that O'Hare would be a great opportunity for the city of Chicago to move forward.
Are you aware of any discussions?
No, I'm not aware of it. No. So there was the example of the green fleets for the taxis, right? And those were benefits not only within O'Hare, but throughout the city. When they picked up their fares and ran around, they had lower emissions.
One final question. Why did the you mentioned the pilot program about was it faster access to or something?
Yeah.
Why was it stopped?
All right, so there was some pushback. So first, it was renewed twice, 6-month periods, before it was stopped, right? And some of the other taxi operators, that didn't go, CNG, got enough political muscle, that they got the city to stop it, basically. But the participants in the program, rapidly adopted CNG-powered taxis and loved it. I mean, they found that even without, grants or, other tax incentives or whatever, just, faster access to the passengers, was enough of a benefit for them to run their businesses, buying the newer, vehicles.
So is this a cautionary tale for those who want to jump on these opportunities the government creates because there is no long-term uncertainty that programs can continue?
All right, so certainly having long-term certainty, would help get the investments into the marketplace. I mean, if you said that it's a 5-year program, then you would have gotten a lot more investment. If somebody looks at a 6-month program that might or might not be renewed, and has to pay a couple $1,000s more up front for the vehicle, they're kind of saying, well, am I going to get it back, within the 6 months that I can count on, right? But if you tell them it's a 5-year program and it has a payback of 3 years, then they'll, more people will do it, and that applies, throughout, government's dealings with the private marketplace. So it's, not only these conditions for access, but the purchases as well. I mean, if you could say that, I want to look at your environmental metrics, and I want improvements, but if you're performing well, I'm going to use you for 5 years. I'm not going to just use you for 1 year. And here's what I'm expecting. Can you meet it, right? If you're unwilling to talk about a contract that goes beyond a year, or it goes beyond even a month in some cases, you're not going to get the same environmental improvements. And in many cases, you're not going to get the cost savings that can come from a multi-year contract.
Well, thank you so much. Okay.